Steam locomotives. Not many are known to exist as of today, as a good majority of them have been retired and scrapped, while some others have been spared from the scrappers' torch and have been used for a variety of activities: preservation, donation to museums, and even full-on restoration projects, with some actually being operable enough to be operated on certain excursion routes, many of which take place all throughout the United States, as well as the rest of the world. This of course doesn't mean that all of the steam locomotives will come out unscathed. Even in the 21st century, there's been a certain history of steam locomotive malfunction. At one time in 1999, however, a certain Soo Line steam locomotive had undergone a bit of a pain during a run through Minnesota. This is the story of the Minnesota Soo Line accident of 1999. Before we talk about the wreck, let's talk about the two railroads involved at the time. The Soo Line Railroad, originally known as the Minneapolis-St. Paul and Sault Ste. Marie Railroad, was first founded in 1888. It, of course, became the Soo Line Railroad after a 1961 acquisition took place, and the Soo Line would take over a majority of trackage that had been owned by various different companies, especially the Milwaukee Road. In 1987, the Soo Line Railroad would eventually allow for Wisconsin to have its own unique railroad established, known as the Wisconsin Central Limited. First founded in 1987, both Soo Line and Wisconsin Central would hold the trackage of a majority of the states of Wisconsin as well as Minnesota, working together, sort of like brother and sister companies. What this of course doesn't always mean that any case should be treated like it's a good familial matter. The fates of both railroads would mainly occur with merging/absorption into larger companies. For Soo Line, they would absorb into Canadian Pacific in 1990, and as for Wisconsin Central, they would merge with Canadian National after a corporate buyout occurred in 2001. But of course, 2 years before that happened, the Soo Line and the Wisconsin Central would face quite the dilemma, which was more of an unexpected occurrence rather than just a straight up abysmal issue on the railroad in the state of Minnesota. On May 10, 1999, a Soo Line steam locomotive known as 2719 was supposed to have its own scheduled excursion run. It had been sitting in storage as a static display for over 30 years in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, before officially being brought out for full restoration in the hopes to get some excursions put together as part of historical significance. The excursions in question would include a May 2nd, 1999 through Chippewa Falls, as well as a Colfax to Cadott round trip on May 8th. May 22nd and 23rd of 1999 would allow for 2719 to doublehead along with another Soo Line steam locomotive number 1003. But of course, none of those would happen. May 10th would turn out to be 2719's worst possible nightmare, as it would be pulled out of a storage siding, prepared to make its own excursion route outside of a rail yard. Irvine Yard in particular was meant to have the 2719 sit by in preparation for the next excursion. However, that of course would turn out to be 2719's last moments, at least for a while. Meanwhile, a Wisconsin Central freight train was heading westbound towards Irvine Yard. Not much was known about the consist itself, although the engine that was pulling the train was SD45 number 6623. As they made their way towards Irvine Yard, 2719 was prepped to be moving backwards outside of the yard in order to get it to move out onto the main line, But then, the Wisconsin Central came into sight, and they didn't have time to get out of the way. The crew at the time would bail out before impact, and then the collision was a hard one. 2719's damage was quite visible from the side. Its left side, which included a large dent in the boiler, as well as a large segment of the outside walkway being dislodged and broken off, and even connecting rods and the headlamp to all be gone. While the locomotive was only held as partial restoration at the time, it still had yet to be fully completed for its next excursion. While not all of the parts were thankfully dislodged or broken, the train would no longer be operable, as the damage was quite chaotic to a majority of its benefactors. Some components would have to be replaced in order to make 2719 operable again, but unfortunately, they couldn't do much at the time.
It was determined that the cause of this accident was a combination of the Wisconsin Central crew failing to stop properly and the crew handling the 2719 for going onto the main line as the freight train was coming into view. This mixture of coincidences as well as unfortunate predicaments led to some improper choices, such as this one. While both crews were held accountable for their actions, the 2719 would have to undergo certain repairs before being able to go back out onto their own excursions. As for the Wisconsin Central train, the lead engine also sustained a bit of minor damages from the impact, but had received its own repairs and continued services with Wisconsin Central. Eventually, upon the merger with Canadian National, would begin to do service with them as well, though still retaining its Wisconsin Central livery for most of its service life. Eventually, it would be passed down to the National Railway Equipment Company, or NREX, where it was given a renumbering just as well. Unfortunately, not much more is known about this engine as of today. Little documentation exists as of recently, perhaps alluding to the fact that the Wisconsin Central 6623 is possibly scrapped, although we cannot confirm at this time. Even though both of these older railroads have been situated with larger railroads since then, and most of their trackage has now been owned by their parent companies respectively, this accident in particular has been greatly preserved, especially on certain social media posts. And we can thank Facebook user Jeff Terry for being the main man responsible for most of the pictures of 2719 before and after the accident. This accident, of course, is a good reminder that if you're going to handle an old steam locomotive that's almost a century old, you're going to need to be more careful with prepping it out onto the main line. And you're also going to need to keep account of what's out there on the tracks, regardless of what the location is. Interestingly enough, though, there was another accident involving 2719 occurring in Chippewa Falls on December 20th, 1924. By then, the engine was amazingly only a year old when this happened. However, this is another story for another time.